This is the second coming of the church. I'm not sure if you're familiar with George Barna or not. He's a church researcher. And love or hate him, he's very hard to ignore it. Sometimes reading his books is like having, bricks thrown in your face. He goes out, he does the research, and he just throws his conclusions right at you. And the second coming of the church was a couple years old now, but it really, I thought, captured well the shift in church culture that leaders are struggling to catch up with. If you feel like you're a hamster on a wheel that keeps just going around, this might explain a little bit why. He calls on the second coming of the church to be a healing of a dying body. He says the typical church as we know it today has a rapidly expiring shelf life. The core attributes of our society, language, customs, dress styles, dominant leisure pursuits, relational emphases, values and the like are being substantially reshaped and reconfigured every few years. A lot of this being driven by global consumer culture, right? Who you can't be happy with the style of pants today, because if you are, I can't sell you any tomorrow. So I've got to come up with a new style to make you not like your pants today, so that you're going to buy another new pair tomorrow. Think about the technologies. How long did we use the phonograph? We used the phonograph 100 years. Okay. How long did we use the cassette tape? That was an aberration. The cassette tape. How long did we use that? That was
20 years, maybe.
Yeah. How long did we use the CDs? They're going out quick. I just took my daughter out 2 days ago to buy her an MP3 player. You are no longer going to have something that needs to go into something else. It's all going to be downloaded, and you'll download right in your car, and you won't have things on the shelf to buy. You'll just go online and it'll all be downloaded. Right? So we have the phonograph, and then we have the cassette tape, and then we have the CD, and now we have the MP3. Who knows what's coming after that? But these technologies, their shelf life is getting shorter and shorter and shorter.
On the computer today, we went to look for the adapter to the internet.
Right.
And it occurred to me that all I really need is a phone calling card that I can slip into my machine and make it work. And count my minutes down, when I'm out every minute.
Right.
Without having to get all the rest. So somehow that may even be in the future.
I went into a Rite Aid the other day, and I couldn't find the film. And I asked, I need some 35 millimeter film. We don't sell film anymore. No film, they don't sell any, because it's all digital cameras now. We don't sell film anymore.
I remember when we had for our panels.
But just to illustrate his point, how quickly, right, things are going. The majority of people who made a first decision for Christ are no longer connected to a Christian church within just 8 weeks of having made such a decision. Wow. Some of this can be attributed to evangelistic efforts like the Jesus film, which is wonderful at exposing people to the gospel, but they pack up and leave and take to the next village if there's not the follow-up here this time. But even still, our own churches in the West are not doing a great job at capturing people who are making these decisions for Christ. And of course, this linear reasoning is being replaced with what he calls mosaic thinking, which is taking, borrowing here and there from different sources. And it's quite a challenge, especially when we're giving sermons in a very linear fashion. Okay, Protestant pastors work an average of 65 hours a week, juggling 16 major dimensions of activities. a hearty amen from the pastors in the room, right? What do you think some of those 16 are? What are you expected to do and to be during any typical week?
Feed the flock.
The feed, right? To teach. What else? Visitation. Funerals. Counseling.
Well, all those sacerdotals do this. Yeah, all those sacerdotals.
Sweep the floor. If nobody else shows up,
Close
you're out there
the
doing
church
that.
doors at night.
Close the church doors at night. Right? If there's a building project, you're expected to be a general contractor.
Right. If there's stuff in a community, sometimes you got to go to that.
You're to be the community advocate. A social activist. Get things better. That's a lot of demands. 16 major activities he's found in his research that pastors do. Wow.
Okay.
No wonder that the average tenure of a pastor in Protestant churches has declined to just 4 years. Overwork, too many demands, impossible job. Those who have turned to Christianity and churches seeking truth and meaning have left empty-handed, confused by the apparent inability of Christians themselves to implement the principles they profess. Woo! I think in Barna's writing, he said this has been the one thing that he has had the most difficulty coming to grips with. Is the fact that Christians claim to be different, but all indicators are they're not that much. 20 years ago, this is an interesting fact, 20 years ago the most committed believers to their church gave an average of 4 blocks of time, right, to a week to religious corporate activity, right? We go to church on Sunday morning, we go to Sunday evening service, we go to Wednesday night prayer meeting, and we go to Bible study, women's meeting, men's meeting, whatever. So we'll connect with the church and the church community on average 4 times a week. Today, even the most committed, you get 2. They'll give you 2 blocks of time. One is Sunday morning, right? And they'll only give you one other, and you better make it good. It better be worth their while. These are busy people with a lot of other options. Wow, that's a challenge for a pastor, isn't it? In his view, small groups never really seem to have caught on. There's a lot of talk about them. There's a lot of curriculum out there. And the church says that he's done. He doesn't see if they've caught on significantly. He said very few people read their Bible on their own. The only time they're hearing it is when you're saying it from up front on Sunday. The potential for developing a network of church-based relationships is undermined by the lack of time people devote to their church activities. Talk about church family, building church communities. It's becoming more difficult to do that. Have you experienced that?
Mm-hmm.
From church home to spiritual pit stop. More and more Americans are beginning to view church as a rest stop along their spiritual journey, rather than as a final destination. Religion has become a commodity that we consume rather than one in which we invest ourselves. Oh, we're going to church shopping. When did that term come into the vocabulary? And what's behind that? We just want to see which one's going to serve us the best. That's a different mindset.
Right.
That's a different mindset than we're here to serve, we're here to invest our life, we're here to build our community.
And focus in, this is the church that the Lord would have us to be at.
Yep. Wow. Americans are unwilling to be held accountable for their beliefs and their resulting behaviors. Whatever happened to church discipline? Have you seen church discipline lately? Somebody in the congregation, right? Commits a sin, and the elders come to that, and that person's not going to sit around and go through any kind of process at your church. Are you kidding? They are out of there. They're down the church down the street. They are out of there. They're not going to be accountable to you. Okay. Americans have a firm understanding. These are bad assumptions, but that we often make. One is that Americans have a firm understanding of the basic tenets of Christianity. You can no longer assume that they know even the basic Bible stories. It used to be that the Bible stories were the common culture and the common language that held them together. When you said, oh, that guy's acting like a good Samaritan, people knew the story. Mm-hmm. Now, what are you talking about? Right? We don't have this common vocabulary anymore. People who believe in God believe in the God of Israel. That's a bad assumption. Right? We've got a lot of definitions of God floating around in America these days. If the pastor is a good enough teacher, that gift will compensate for mediocre leadership. That's probably a bad assumption. It's okay for congregations not to bring their Bible to church services. They're just going to put them up on the thing anyway, on the screen anyway.
What do you think about that? I mean, with the new technology, you think that's what's happening?
Right. What we do in our church, I always like to have Bibles available, and to have people have it in their hand. We're going to be putting this up here, but you may want to read along. And if you don't have one, ushers have some in the back. Just raise your hand, I'll give you one. You know what? You can keep that too. Mm-hmm. We always have that. We always do that on Sunday. So I think you want to get the word in people's hands. You don't just want it to be flashing up front. Some people might be nervous and don't want to put their hand up. They want to, you still got the word up on the board in front of them. Yeah.
I think that churches that have good pastors, good teaching pastors, you usually find members who bring the Bible to church. If that pastor has taught and trained at church, and then they will have Bibles in the pew pockets for visitors or those who may come. For the most part, but they are strong pastors and committed to the Word and this kind of thing. Usually find a church where people don't come up to the Bible.
Right. So if you have a strong pastor who's a strong teaching ministry, generally the people know and they bring their Bible.
They bring the Bible to follow along with them, to mark in their Bible and that kind of thing. So a lot of the churches today that are New Age, and I use that term to say many churches today where the Word is not the main thing, then you won't find a lot of people with their Bibles.
Right.
But if it's a church that's Word-centered, Word-based, pastors very committed to teaching people to love God and the Word, use as a church where everybody has a Bible.
We could debate that. I'm attending a church right now that's very liturgical, and they put everything up on the overhead.
Yeah.
And gosh, out of 300 members, I'll bet 10 bring the Bibles. But it is one of the most mature churches I've ever been in. They really love the Lord. They're dedicated. It's mission oriented. They preach the gospel. But they're not carrying the Bible. And it's one of those things where if I was in charge, man, they'd have those Bibles out, stuffing pencils, and we'd be working it.
You know Dr. Rodney Dean, but they don't. Rodney Dean and I brothers, we call ourselves twins. Rodney Dean and I have been sharing a long time. There's a cultural difference too when it comes to church. Now, in the black church, the old black church, where I grew up, and the church where I served, in those churches that I affiliated with, they're very strong on bringing the Bibles. And most of these churches won't use an overhead for the worship. Some of the newer churches will use overheads or words to songs, and they'll post up text as the pastor's preaching.
Right.
But for the most part, that's new. And for the most part, the older churches won't do that. Right. Rodney Dean comes to us and great Bible teacher. But in his preaching and in his teaching, he has to have his overhead.
Mm-hmm.
And he flips and flips. And that's good. That's right, indeed. But for the most part, in the black community, that's not the case.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not saying one case is better than the other. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that in this particular culture, it's the proclamation of the word. And we have responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we stand, preach, read some verse, and congregation, and this kind of thing. And this becomes such a cherished part of worship. And so people have a great affinity for the word, just reading the word. Mm-hmm. But this new thing, we're just not there.
Thanks for saying that. Yeah. Here's a bad assumption. Who put that up there? Qualified pastor should have a seminary degree. That's a bad assumption? Not always necessary. The best way to revitalize churches is to create new ones. The fact is that most new church plants do not fly, just like most new businesses don't fly. Non-Christian is a bad assumption that non-Christians are vitally interested in salvation. If you are having a great speaker at your church, they will flock in to hear the gospel. That's probably not a good assumption. In search of leadership, here's a common sentiment from a pastor. I love the teaching aspect of my job. And I can get by when it comes to planning, but resolving disputes, focusing people's attention, mobilizing people, generating resources to enable change, all of that is not really my strong suit. And another article would say probably 72% of the pastors would echo this. Basically saying, I want to teach, I don't want to lead. Right? Because what is leadership? Generate resources, mobilize people, focus people's attention. That's leadership. That's the stuff of leadership. So they're basically saying, I want to be a teacher. I don't particularly want to be a leader. Organizations that run aground during times of instability invariably lack vision or strong leaders, or both. Teaching and leading are related but distinct. They are different giftings. It is really nice and powerful when they're together, but they're not always together. Most senior pastors serving churches today are not truly leaders, although they hold a leadership position. They primarily are teachers. One size does not fit all. Coping with the rapid, fundamental, continual change is perhaps more difficult for the church than for almost any other group. Right? Just try to introduce a new song next week and see what happens. Those old songs, that was God, right? I don't know what you're doing now, but that was God back then. The church, okay, let's admit it, we don't adapt that well. People expect these days high quality and a customized, relevant solution to their needs. If those that a church is trying to reach do not feel that the services and programs offered were created for them, they'll leave without a second thought. I remember one guy, I don't know, anyway, I met a young man and asked him where he went to church. He said, oh, well, I was going to, it was so-and-so town, a Presbyterian church, which I knew was a PCA church. He said, but now I'm going to the so-and-so town Foursquare. I said, oh, really? I'm just thinking, do you have any idea of the leap you just made? Right. Theologically, historically, culturally, do you have any idea? Certain things that go over there better. There's just no appreciation. It's just not a second thought leaving the Presbyterian church to go to the Foursquare. Just amazing. This is the way it is now. Right? People weren't born a Baptist, going to die a Baptist. People just aren't like that anymore. They just stop around. And hey, if it's not good, I'll go find somewhere else. Americans will choose speed over depth every time. My poor wife, who is a woman of substance in a world that's not, and having a Bible study, and my wife loves theology. She just reads theology books. More than I do. I read leadership books. She reads theology books. She just loves it, and she's just a deep person. And she's there with some of the housewives, and she's trying to get all into it. And at one point, the one really nice woman, she's been in our church probably 7 or 8 years, says, "Do we really need to know all this stuff? I mean, it's just enough that I love God, He loves me, and I'm just trying to be nice to people. We really need to know all this stuff." My poor wife. What do you say to that? No, it's okay. Go ahead and keep on being shallow. Yeah, it's fine. What do you say? You kind of do need to know that this will bring you into a deeper, understanding of all that God is. But the whole idea is just, do I really need that? Americans will choose speed over depth every time. Over time, the drive for self-preservation overwhelms the desire for true growth. We must have a clear operational definition of success. What is it as leaders that we're really going for here? If we never define what we're striving to achieve. The church in the case study last night, did you have much of a sense that church knew where it was going?
No.
They really did not know what success was. And they obviously weren't getting there. In most cases, the values contained in church mission statements do not surface to any great degree in the life of the church itself. The new cultural realities. To be effective, we must learn to target our efforts and to contextualize what we have to offer to others so that they see our offerings as relevant, beneficial, and accessible. That church that we talked about last night, that was really a visitor hostile church. We don't usually say that. They would not have thought that. But the experience of a visitor going to that church, it would have been a very alien experience to them. To have to stand up for that long, to listen to songs they haven't heard, to then sit down and listen to a 50-minute historical lecture about the Far East. And we tried to bring some friends, and some of my friends tried to bring, and they just would look at us like, why would you possibly have thought this was relevant to my life? And then that doesn't really encourage you to bring people back next week or invite other people. In actuality, it was a visitor hostile church.
Can you break out what you mean with contextualize?
What do you think we mean when we say contextualize?
Can you go back to the...
Yeah.
So to contextualize what we have to offer.
I have an answer, but I want to open it up to the students
I'm
first.
trying to understand.
I don't want to be the answer guy all the time. What do you think he means when he says contextualize what we have to offer?
Put the scripture down to each person's level.
Explain the scripture to each person's level, to an appropriate level. That's part of contextualization.
You think that he's meaning to bring into a context that's relevant, and the term relevant and contextualize are synonyms. Bring it to a context of life. Kind of decontextualize the scriptures and then recontextualize it today so that it has significance and relevance and meaning to it.
Right. So that taking the relevance of scripture, what it spoke at, and talking about how that applies today, that would be contextualizing.
And just to me, it seems like there's something else that's there, which kind of means I'm walking a mile in your shoes, where they see me as a person like them, as a pastor. So now, contextualize to me means more of a being a person to them rather than this figure.
Right.
I love it dearly, but the pastor from Coral Gables is a That's what I'm getting from the contextualization. There's another dimension there, in addition to the relevancy of what, not instead of sales presentation, but what is their benefit for being here.
Right.
I think there's more to that piece, or more to that word. Is that from Barna?
Yes, this is from
That's
Barna.
from him. I'd be interested in what his thought is on that.
Yeah. He talks about effective communication, which this generation highly values. You know, when you think about how much they've been communicated at through TVs, movies. This generation is very sophisticated in their how they receive media and communication. Effective communicators. One is how an audience absorbs information. Right, a 50-minute historical lecture probably, you even look at, they used to do the headline news. You'd have the person's head that was talking, and then you'd have the weather report, and then you'd have the sports scores, and then you'd have the scrolling breaking news, and you have the clock up in the other corner. We're much more sophisticated than we used to be. We can take in a lot of different things at once. And then you go to church, and it's just some guy. That's what it feels like to a lot of this younger generation. They want more to be communicated with differently. What will an audience pay attention to? What conveys a clear and meaningful message? And then to seek and evaluate feedback. This is something we probably don't ask for much, and certainly not enough as leaders. The values of younger adults. Younger adults are accustomed to receiving information at a faster rate, right, than older adults are. Time is treasure. Do not waste my time. Right? If you're going to do something, it better be worth it to me and for me. This better be of value. Words are important. Words do mean things. And attitude is everything. Right? Don't come at me with all the answers. Come at me with the questions and take me along the journey that you were on to find those answers. And maybe I'll find the same answers too. Right? That attitude of where I'm a fellow journeyman, I'm soul journeying just through life just as you are. Let me show you what I've discovered down the road that I've taken. The attitude. At the same time, there is a thus saith the Lord. So how do you communicate thus saith the Lord to this generation that wants to be taken on in the journey? It is getting tougher for leaders out there.
Yeah.
I really think it is. To remain true to the truths of the gospel, but then to be able to communicate them in a way that they'll be received. The medium used to transmit the information impacts the perceived credibility of that information.
What does that mean?
What do you think? Let's go back to that.
How it's presented, the medium used, the young people will understand something that's done in a young people way, using that which young people use.
The PowerPoint. Computer.
PowerPoint, for example, that's done the older people. The new group of people today will accept the screen in the worship, as you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
But the old crowd, they have a problem with that. And so the medium that's used is going to have an impact.
For example, at our church, we still have the old way of pretty much doing announcements where a person gets up and does the actual announcements from whichever in the book.
Right.
And so there was a project that I was leading, and so I had another friend of mine that's into making a DVD presentation. And we had the screen and everything, but like you said, you already used the screen, but I had the whole video, real commercial
Right.
of the whole deal that's getting ready to come up. And it was just fascinating because the younger group, they were like, yeah, we're there.
Right.
The older church, remember, it took a minute for them to get come like that.
Right. They were waiting for someone to get up and tell them.
Right.
Whereas you had audio, you had
Yeah.
pictures flying back, you had music playing. Yeah. See, to a young person, that's credible. You standing up saying, "Come to my potluck," is not credible. Me seeing cranberry sauce fly at me, that's funny. That's credible. I'm going to that.
And that's the target audience that he's talking about. It sounds to me like what he's referring to.
Yeah.
You know, this also creates another tension involved, just came up in the last couple of weeks. And we have multiple generational, a lot of stuff that goes on, so we're not really wrestling being locked in a certain way of doing things. But an interesting question came up was, is there a devaluing, is there a disrespect being shown towards the older generation? There's such an emphasis to communicate with the younger generation that it's almost like there's a disrespect that's there. And it was an interesting question. It wasn't with a bad heart or bad spirit. It was just really a question because of the very things being said here. And when you look at the scriptures about the value of the older person, the respect that's there, we're to gain from them. And what some of this does, it almost kind of puts them on the shelf because they can't compete with a fast-paced communication. They can't compete with all that's going on. So the credibility issue is a factor because now they're not viewed as being credible if they can't communicate in a way that what they have to say is worthy of listening to. And so it really brought in quite a conversation that several of us got involved in on what is the role that we have of being able to be just wise and kind of alert to some of these things we're talking about right here, but at the same time not shelving the older person, showing the disrespect, devaluing, because now you can't do both. So now that we fragment the church even further by having services for 55 years old and older, 40 to 55, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
All the dimensions, there's a lot that's really at play with all of these. What Barna throws out in terms of all these demographic issues, they're interesting and they're real. But there's also another dimension to it that I think sometimes we don't really pay a lot of attention to in terms of discussing the collateral issues around it.
Right. And there are a lot of collateral issues around it. Yeah. It's getting tougher. More trends and values. For this generation, there's no grand purpose in life. The reason for living is comfortable survival. There's no real value focusing on the future. Hey, a plane could run into your building today. Who knows? It's so unpredictable. This generation is not as good at planning. And of course, with this generation, there's no absolutes. Everything is relative to the situation and the individual. And there's no omnipotent, all-knowing deity that guides reality. This is where, this is the apologetic of the day. It was different even 20 years ago. I know when I was in college, if people knew you were a Christian, they may not agree, but they kind of respected the fact that you took a stand for something. That's cool. Now, if you're a Christian, okay, you're homophobic, intolerant. I don't respect that you're taking this stand. You're the problem here. So the tide has turned. It was interesting. It's interesting to read that some of you had to read Blue Like Jazz for the last one. What a meandering book that is. He talks about his friend over here, but somehow in the middle of it, he finds God. In the strangest places. But yet, this is how this generation is finding God. They're finding it from this randomness and this piecing together. And God's not intimidated by this. He makes himself known. That's a really weird, interesting book to read.
We could sit down and talk about that because I really question if that man understands what Jesus actually came here to do. Because there's some things that he just continues to do throughout that Bible, and it's like he doesn't have any remission for or anything like that.
Right.
So, and he did some great things. He was definitely daring and stuff I wouldn't have never done.
Like when they apologize.
Right.
At the convention booth. But yeah, this younger generation is going to seek after and experience spirituality probably different than we have in the traditional churches that we grew up in.
So is that where he's referring to Mosaic thinking?
Yes.
Yes, small pieces.
Yeah, you just take things from different areas and sort of build a reality out of it. That's sort of the Mosaic thinking. That's that guy who can go to the Presbyterian church and then the Foursquare church.
Yeah.
Without realizing, he just, made a drift in the time-space continuum.
A lot of that's going on today where people are crossing denominational lines without realizing that there's a whole different set of beliefs.
Yeah, and they're losing.
Yeah. Do I believe eternal security? Yeah. Do I believe eternal security? Do I believe, So, which goes to show that people are not spiritual.
Right.
In the sense of having a depth.
Right, because they're picking that other church because either I like that music better or my child likes the Sunday school better. Yeah.
I was going to say on that comment the pastor made, I think too, quite a few of our younger generation too are, and they're young, we're young, and kind of consider us like a rattlesnake when we bite. A baby rattlesnake, we don't know how to control our venom sometimes, so sometimes it might come off as disrespectful, but they're looking for not the denomination, but the true common goal of Christianity, you know what I'm saying? And so sometimes in search for that, with our immaturity, we flock to something not really knowing the historical background or all that it entails, because many of us haven't been taught. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
So, but the pursuit of genuine Christianity is something to be applauded. With every new generation, there's things that we can applaud, and then there's warnings that seem to get thrown up.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point. Talks about philosophy of life. Most Americans possess an entitlement mentality. We believe we deserve every possible good and positive outcome without having earned those outcomes. Most Americans do not recognize the underlying existential or postmodern undertones to their belief system. Right? The bumper sticker or the phrase, whatever. That's kind of the motto of the generation. Right? Whatever. Right? It means nothing really matters. Right? What underlies that? Nothing really matters. It's all just empty. Right? There's no grand scheme to it all. Perceptual filter. Until the church can persuade people that absolute relativism is not only inherently contradictory, but ultimately self-defeating and wrong, all great biblical teaching can muster will be negated by this perceptual filter that equates truth with personal preference. That's a mouthful, isn't it? He begins to talk about the filters, the worldview people have, and to really become genuinely Christian, that needs to be changed. Otherwise, it used to be that, my pastor was the one that I went to really to hear about life and wisdom and good living and how to please God. Now, he's only one of many voices. Right? Because I was just listening to Charles Stanley on the radio on the way in. And after the service, I'm going to the Benny Hinn concert. And I never miss a day of Oprah. And Dr. Phil walks on water. And he solves everybody's problems. So I'm just, you're one voice now. You used to be the voice. Now you're just one. Right? Because I'm making up my own little reality and who I like to listen to and who I like to hear from.
That's true. That's what's happening.
That's what's happening. Yep. The challenge of being a leader. That's right. Becoming greater.
And then you get compared to.
Yeah. Dr. Phil could have saved that marriage. That's brutal. The game of life is being played differently by each new generation. And right, the classic themes of the baby boomers are right the desire to make a difference. They accept a huge amount of personal financial debt, right? What makes it a pretty challenge to talk these guys into tithing when they're under a mountain of debt. It's difficult with true sustaining relationships. They put a lot of time and money in leisure pursuits, and they're very career oriented. This current generation does not have the expectation that they will have as high a standard of living as their parents did. Right? I probably, my child growing up probably says, I probably will not be able to afford the kind of house that I grew up in. That's the first time in a long time that we've had a generation whose expectations are lower. I mean, generally it's been, I'm going to have bigger, I'm going to have a better car than my dad drove. I'm going to have, you could aspire to have more. But just look at housing prices, right? How are kids ever going to get a starter home for, $450? We're going to have like the landed gentry, you're going to have to hand down, because it's getting out of hand. So this generation has a very different set of expectations and goals. Extracting core life principles from this religious potpourri that I just described a minute ago, loyalty to one church, one faith group, or one theological system is not in their consciousness. Don't tell me what to think. Tell me the options and let me think. Eventually you realize there's no right faith or group, only good people trying to get along and make life worth the trip. Common? So he talks about how the second coming, how do we reformat the church to begin to go after the challenges. The things that he says I don't think are particularly innovative, though. Worship, okay, yeah. Evangelism, service, education, training, building community stewardship. This is stuff the church should be doing all along. I think this is kind of one of the sort of weaknesses of the book. Plus, we have to have a firm and accurate understanding of our business. We're in the life transformation business. Right? That's what Jesus came to do. Seek and save that which is lost. That is our business. We must know the competition for our target audience. Right? What else is pulling on them? We must be effective. We must anticipate, not merely react. The church has been in reaction mode for a long time. There are a number of signs that some people are breaking out of that and actually anticipating things. That's encouraging. Before adopting a course of action, let's consider all the possible alternatives. What do you do when you come across this problem of how do you honor the older folks and yet be relevant to the younger folks? One church that I was at in Sacramento, and I think more churches starting to do this, they planted a church within a church. They didn't want to offend the old guard who liked the hymns, but yet they knew there's no way we're gonna be relevant and have. So they got permission and they hired another pastor, and on the same campus they built a different building, a more contemporary looking building, and they had a more contemporary looking service. And the older folks are happy to keep going to this one, and this one just exploded. Once they did that, this one exploded. And the pastor didn't preach at both. And he hired a pastor to lead that congregation, which a lot of pastors have a hard time with that. It's a church split. They call it a church within a church.
That's right. So, but it's still a very profound and intentional.
Right. No, they did not call it a church plant, because to them a church plant would have really been taking that, making another congregation. They still were under the same umbrella.
Same location.
Same location. Yeah, one building right next to the other. Yeah, it was kind of like a gymnasium-looking building next to the steeple and the tradition.
We've done that very thing, and it really isn't a split. It really is. It wouldn't be any different than having a youth group that's not in service. And it's really just added a whole new dimension of being able to do ministry. And we do a lot of things together still. There's an integration that takes place as well, but as far as the week-to-week kind of stuff that goes on, we just did a big conference where we were together doing the conference, and there's a lot of outreach ministries where we do it together. But as far as the week-to-week worship and ministries, it's distinct, and we do call it church within the church. We actually have 3 of them, but it certainly is not. It doesn't even feel like being close to a split.
Split has a negative connotation.
But that's a response to some of these realities.
But the essence is different than a split.
In Renton, they've done a similar thing under a large roof, new building, Assembly of God Church on Maple Valley Highway. And what they've done is create what I would call a fairly large chapel for the older members of the church. And I think they hold 2 services for the older members. And you can hear the kids wailing away in the main sanctuary. But the piece of it which is so valuable is the honoring of the elderly, as we were talking about it 40 minutes ago. And practically speaking, it keeps the dollars in the church. The old people don't go away. And young people...
Right, that was a concern with this.
Young people don't give like the older people.
Right.
So you've got that all under one roof, and they do potlucks together, they do studies together, and other kinds of things.
Becoming more and more common.
A friend of mine in New York, the pastor's, he now preaches the first 2 services, there are 3 services. We have 6 a.m. and 8 o'clock. And then at 11 o'clock, he has his younger assistant pastor preaching to that crowd. And that his assistant pastor, that's kind of his own little congregation where they raise their offering and they kind of challenge you. So he still has, the same feeling of the other church, but then that younger crowd, that 30 to 40 crowd, you got another young guy in there ministering to them, so they just busting the walls out there too. So
well, it takes a secure senior pastor to be able to do that.
Right.
You can't have somebody who wants to control everything, or everybody's got to hear from me every week. That takes a maturity to get that thing.
I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and the guy who was teaching the pastors was saying one of the problems with pastors, senior pastors, is being able to share their power that they have in order for the church to grow.
Yep.
Do you know of St. Mark Lutheran Church right here? They have 22 retired pastors, 4 current chaplains, 3 varied services, all under one roof.
Right.
And they have the contemporary sandwiched in between the older. They have like their 40s in the morning, and then their seniors in 11 o'clock. And the contemporary is like around 10 o'clock.
It's getting tricky.
Well, and you talked about a pastor who is secure within his own calling. To have 22 retired pastors
Critiquing yourself.
You've got
That's not the definition of hell. Let me get through these and we'll take a break. Let's see. Effective change requires detailed planning. There's a tendency when you approach something that is potentially as complex as this is to just start trying things willy-nilly, and that can really destabilize a congregation. Forward movement is achieved by building on existing strengths. The church can be effective as a church only if it operates in scriptural boundaries, right? Not at all talking about going outside of those. Creating a better future, the goal of vision, requires rational innovation. Success demands we think holistically and ultimately lean on your own understanding. Okay, let's take a break.